Sophia Maria Beckett was the illegitimate daughter of Richard Gunningworth, Earl of Penwood. As a small child, Sophie was abandoned on the doorstep of the Earl's house, where she was brought up with the privileges of an upper-class girl, such as education and good manners, but without any title to society. To the people, Sophie was no more than the daughter of an old and deceased friend of the Count's, but the strong resemblance to the man made it clear that she was in fact his daughter, even if she was illegitimate. Sophie is described in the books as a blonde girl with green eyes. Sophie never had a brotherly relationship with her father, as the Earl merely took care of her expenses, but made no effort to form a relationship with her. Instead, her only family were the house servants, the housekeeper, and the servants. Sophie knew she was a bastard, and her life at Penwood was all she remembered, except for a vague recollection of her maternal grandmother, who raised her in her early years and then took her to her father's house, and that her mother had died when she was born. A few years later, when Sophie was 10 years old, the Count decided to marry. His new wife, a widow, already had 2 daughters close in age to Sophie, Rosamond and Posy. Sophie had been thrilled to have 2 new sisters and a stepmother. She thought that maybe if she loved her, the Count would begin to love her too, but it was not to be. The day the new Countess arrived at Penwood, Sophie was introduced as the Earl's ward, but the woman knew immediately, from the physical resemblance, that she was in fact his illegitimate daughter. This, of course, did not please him, and although Sophie was still a child, he let her know that he knew she was a bastard, and that she would not allow him to feel equal to his daughters, so she could not relate to them. Amarinta, as the new Countess was called, had insisted that Sophie be thrown out of the house, but the Count would not allow it. This led to the little girl enduring abuse from her 2 stepsisters, especially Rosamond, who enjoyed torturing her, but Posy, though she seemed to be against it, did nothing about it. 4 years later, the Earl died. During that time, Araminta failed to conceive an heir, so the title of Earl of Penwood was inherited by a cousin. Given the situation, Araminta was left with only the Earl's fortune to inherit, but he left her an annual income of only £2,000, which could be increased to £6,000 on the condition that she would look after Sophie until she was 20 years old. Sophie was never told of the money she was due, nor of the dowry her father had left for when she found a husband. Sophie spent the next few years serving Araminta, Posy, and Rosamond as a maid, even in her early 20s, for she feared leaving without knowing what lay in store for her on the streets as nothing more than a bastard. One night, the 3 women were preparing to attend a masked ball at the Bridgertons' house. Araminta had prepared her daughters in the hope that they would catch one of the unmarried Bridgerton brothers, Colin or Benedict, since Gregory was still a teenager. Though, well, she only hoped Rosamond would do it, as she didn't consider Posy pretty enough to get a good husband. That night, as soon as Araminta and her 2 daughters left, the housekeeper and the other servants prepared Sophie for the masked ball. She was dressed in a silver dress and gloves, engraved with the initials of her late grandmother's name, to match Araminta's shoes, and a mask that covered most of her face and concealed her identity. Before leaving, the housekeeper instructed him to leave the ball before midnight to prevent Araminta from realizing he had gone. Benedict, for his part, was forced to attend the ball by his mother, who was persistently trying to get him a wife and forcing him, in turn, to dance with the ugly girls at the ball. He was about to ask Penelope Featherington to dance when Sophie arrived at the party and stole the show. Mesmerized by her beauty, Benedict asked her to dance, but Sophie didn't know how to dance, so they decided to just go out on the balcony and talk. There, Benedict tried to get to know her a little better, but Sophie preferred to keep her true identity to herself by lying, as she thought this would be her only night of freedom before returning to serve Amarinta and her daughters. That night, as he tried to gather clues to her identity through disguised questions, she let Benedict kiss her. She thought there was no reputation to disgrace, so she had nothing to lose. But her illusion was interrupted by the midnight warning that guests must remove their masks. Terrified, Sophie fled the scene in panic. remembering that it was her deadline at the ball and leaving Benedict, who had been accosted by Lady Danbury as he pursued her. But the boy had managed to keep a clue. And no, it wasn't a slipper like in Cinderella, the story from which this book is inspired, but his glove, or well, Sophie's late grandmother's glove. Later that night, Sophie found herself back in reality. Benedict, for his part, sought out his mother in the hope that she might recognize which family the initials engraved on the garment belonged to. Violet immediately recognized that they belonged to the Gunningworth family, but since the Earl had died without an heir, it was most likely to one of his 2 adopted daughters, Posy or Rosamond. Determined, Benedict went with the gauntlet to Gunningworth House in search of his mystery lady. But as soon as Araminta heard of his presence, she ordered Sophie to stay locked in her wardrobe cleaning all her shoes, including the one she had worn on the day of the ball, which she had scuffed. Benedict met Posy and Rosamond, but knew at once that neither was his mystery lady, so he left. But as he did so, Araminta saw him looking at Sophie's glove, and it was at that moment that he learned that the girl had run away the night before the masked ball. Furious, Araminta threw Sophie out of her house, who left with the little savings she had kept during her life and 2 brooches she had stolen from her stepmother's expensive shoes. 2 years passed in which Sophie wandered the streets looking for work. She tried to become a governess for children, but as she had no recommendation, no one wanted to hire her, so she ended up working as a maid for a wealthy family in a town near London. There she lived more quietly than where she was going to live, as the work was less. But everything became more complicated with the arrival of Philip, the son of the house, who constantly harassed her. One night, during a house party, Philip and 2 other men tried to mole Sophie, but were interrupted by Benedict, who fortunately was also at the party. Benedict proposed to Sophie to take her to London and get her a job at his mother's house, to which she accepted without hesitation. And although at first she expected him to recognize her, after their fleeting encounter at the masked ball, that didn't happen. The girl had changed a lot in the last 2 years. She had cut her hair and sold it for money to survive, and she had lost several kilos, so Benedict did not notice at any time her strong resemblance to the woman he had been looking for the last 2 years. After saving her from what could have been a terrible event, Benedict took Sophie to his cottage a few miles from the village, but on the way they were struck by a severe storm that made Benedict ill, forcing Sophie to take the reins of the carriage. He was surprised that a maid knew how to drive, so she had to invent the story that she was the daughter of the housekeeper of a wealthy family who held her in high esteem and had allowed her to be educated as a member of the family. Arriving at Benedict's house, called My Cottage, they found that none of the servants who looked after the house were there, so they had to spend the night alone. Sophie nursed Benedict through the night, trying to cure his fever, and even gave him a couple of kisses he asked for in his sleep. She also discovered a notebook full of drawings, including one of her running away from the masked ball. The days went by, and Sophie continued to look after Benedict, feeding him, sharing afternoons of tea and reading. Little by little, he discovered that he longed for her and found her company soothing and comforting, something he had never experienced with another woman, let alone a maid. One afternoon, as they shared tea and biscuits together, Benedict was overcome by an uncontrollable desire for her, which made him think that if they did not separate at that moment, he would not respond to his desire to seduce her. He ordered her out of the room with the excuse that he needed to go to the bathroom and fled into the woods to clear his thoughts. Sophie took the opportunity to go for a walk in the surrounding area. As she walked, she came across a lake, but it wasn't alone. There was a naked man bathing in it, and yes, that man was Benedict. Curious, Sophie decided to watch the scene silently until he noticed her and forced her to get out. He dressed her and made her stay on her back until he was done, but just when she thought he would let her go, he pulled her to his body and kissed her. She hadn't resisted. She had wanted to relive the masked ball kiss with all her might, even reliving it over and over in her mind. When they had finished, they discussed the fact that, for him, Sophie was too refined and intelligent to be a mere maid, and that she should find a way to have another life. She resented the fact that he thought she hadn't already tried. Furious, she tried to leave, but he held her back and proposed that she move to London with him. "Be mine," she told him, in an urgent voice. "Be mine right now. Be mine forever. I'll give you everything you want. The only thing I want in return is you." "You want me to be your mistress," she told him bitterly. There was no doubt that what he was proposing was that she live with him without a legal union, since she was only a maid with whom, by the rules of society, she could not have a relationship, let alone marry. He kissed her, hoping he could convince her, unbuttoned the buttons of her dress and laid her on the floor, resting on top of her. Sophie could not resist. She was gripped by desire, until she remembered her mother's life, and her own, and how miserable she was for having been the bastard daughter of a dead earl, all because her mother, at the time, had been a mistress. "I don't want to be your mistress," she said, pulling him away from her. He asked her if she would prefer to continue working as a maid, and she made it clear that she didn't need his help, that she had managed just fine on her own, to which he said, ironically, that it wasn't very clever of him to think so. This infuriated Sophie, who with a hook left Benedict dazed on the floor. As he tried to regain consciousness, she tried to flee but was grabbed by the ankles and laid down beside him. Furious, she announced that she would not be his mistress and would leave the cabin immediately. He threatened to take her to live with him anyway, but she got up and walked to her room where she began to pack her belongings. As he watched her from the doorway and insisted that she go with him, she told him that she simply could not. She could not be his mistress. That sentence left Benedict thinking, and after a few seconds he managed to get to the truth. She was illegitimate. This discovery on his part left Sophie cold, as he thought it solved everything, promised her that he would never leave her alone, and that he would take care of any children they had. She then asked him what would happen if they got married. Benedict's mind then turned to the mysterious lady at the masked ball, who had been the only woman he had ever dreamed of marrying. He didn't know how to answer that, which annoyed Sophie even more. Seeing that she would not budge, Benedict then threatened to charge her with theft, so he would tell the police to release her into his custody. She thought he would be incapable, but he confirmed that he would do it, so long as he could keep her with him. So she told him she would wait for him to take her to London and do it. Later that day, they set out in Benedict's carriage for London. Sophie was scared to death, for it was dancing season, and Araminta might see her and expose her publicly, not to mention that she had stolen the brooches from one of her shoes when she left the house, which made it all the worse. On arriving at the Bridgertons' house, Sophie was warmly welcomed by Violet, who accepted Benedict's request to hire her as Eloise and Francoise's maid, although she suspected that something was amiss. She therefore set out to investigate Sophie's true identity, for no maid could have been as well educated as she was, and she even spoke French. Days passed, and luckily for Sophie, Violet had not found out the truth. Benedict visited the house often enough to see her, until one day when she came out of the house and ran into Posy, who saw her in the distance. Sophie begged her by signs not to tell Araminta, to which the other girl agreed. Minutes later, Benedict appeared on the scene, who, seeing Sophie's face, decided to take her home until she calmed down. Once they arrived, they began to talk about Sophie's feelings about her new job at the Bridgertons. She told him that both Violet and her daughters treated her very well, and even made her feel part of the family by allowing her to join them for afternoon tea as a member of the family. Sophie had wished for nothing more in her life than to have a family like that, as she had been alone since she was born. Surprisingly, Benedict confessed to her that it was difficult to be a Bridgerton, although he loved his family, and that was for sure. He had never been able to stand out on his own merit without always being recognized for being one of the Bridgertons and not Benedict, in most cases, being called number 2. She told him that he was much more than that he was different from the others and very talented, and that he should show his talent to the world and to his family. At that moment, he understood that he loved her for 1,000 reasons, and he kissed her. But that kiss was not like the others. Little by little, they gave in and did what they had been dreaming of for a long time. Even years. They had their first night together. After this, He told her that he would send someone discreet to fetch her things from her mother's house. She immediately refused, reiterating that, despite what had happened, she would not be his mistress. She refused to have an illegitimate child and prayed that she had not become pregnant after that encounter. This annoyed Benedict, who went away, leaving her alone. Sophie returned to the Bridgertons' house, spent the next 2 weeks avoiding encounters with the family more than was entirely necessary, and Benedict did not appear during this time either. One afternoon, while Benedict was chatting with his brothers, the same occasion on which Colin was surprised by Penelope saying he would not marry her, he was approached by Violet, who had written a list of 7 possible wives for him. It was at this point that he confessed to his mother that he was in love with someone who did not belong to the same social status as them. She told him that she would support him in whatever decision he made, but that he should know that it would be a difficult situation, as he would be judged harshly by society. Determined to find Sophie and ask her to marry him, he set out to leave the house but was stopped by Eloise, who, in conspiracy with his mother, persuaded him to go upstairs to the playroom. There Sophie was blindfolded, playing blind man's buffalo with the Bridgertons' younger cousins, 4 children between the ages of 5 and 10. The moment Benedict entered the room and saw Sophie blindfolded, he knew the truth. She was the mysterious woman at the masked ball. "When were you planning to tell me that we knew each other?" he asked her. He was furious and felt cheated. She replied that she simply didn't plan to tell him, as it didn't seem pertinent. She hadn't really wanted to tell him, because she was afraid that he would ask her to be his mistress, which in reality had happened anyway. She had also been hurt by the fact that he didn't recognize her when he saw her again, because she had been dreaming of his face every day after that dance. He angrily complained to her that he had spent 6 months after that dance looking for her. She told him that she had to run away because she had no one, to which he replied that she had him. The girl reminded him that their social differences separated them, and that this had prevented her from even considering looking for him. "Who are you?" he asked her. "I have been a servant since I was 14, and who were you before that?" "A bastard," she replied, and told him the truth, that she was the illegitimate daughter of the Earl of Penwood, the bastard of a nobleman, and the daughter of a maid. Furious at her lie and unable to continue in her presence, Benedict left the place. Sophie decided she had to leave the place. She couldn't afford to be there when Violet and the other Bridgertons found out the truth. And of course, she didn't think they would keep her as a maid after that. However, Sophie decided to say goodbye one last time to Violet, as she felt indebted to her. Violet told her that she knew what was between her and Benedict, but that did not mean she had to leave the house, but she insisted that she could not stay. So Lady Bridgerton gave her some money and ordered a carriage to take her to her destination. Sophie then decided to wait outside the house for the carriage to arrive when she was discovered by Araminta, who loudly called the police. Sophie was whisked off to prison before Violet or anyone else in the Bridgerton family could realize what was happening and help her. Though, to tell the truth, she wished she could be spared the embarrassment. For his part, Benedict had a fencing match with Colin, who almost immediately knew that something was wrong with him, and that it was Sophie. The two talked, and Colin managed to convince Benedict that whatever had happened between him and Sophie, he had to fix it. After this, Benedict ran to his mother's house to look for her, but she was gone. While they were talking, Francesca, Eloise, and Hyacinth burst in with the latest edition of Lady Whistledown, where it told how Sophie had been captured by the police. Both Violet and Benedict immediately ran after her. Meanwhile, Sophie was in a cell when Araminta appeared, telling her that she would be deported to Australia because she had also invented that she had stolen her wedding ring. Sophie asked her why she did all that, and she replied that she simply could not stand that the Count had made her live with a bastard under the same roof and had not been able to give her an heir herself. While they were arguing, Benedict and Violet burst in. Both shared a kiss in front of Araminta, who looked at them, stunned. The boy immediately ordered Sophie to be released since she was his bride. To the surprise, Amarinta threatened to tell everyone that Sophie was a bastard daughter of a whore if he married her. At that moment, Posey appeared, who blamed himself for the theft of Amarinta's shoe pins, The policeman then ordered Sophie to be taken out of the cell, but no one could leave until he knew what was going on. Sophie then told her story, that she was the illegitimate daughter of a nobleman and that her father had left her nothing in his will. It was at that moment that Posey contradicted her by revealing that he had left a dowry for her. Violet then threatened to denounce Araminta and have her imprisoned for stealing Sophie's dowry if she told the truth about the girl's origins. Instead, she was to say that Sophie had been a ward of the Earl of Penwood and that she was the daughter of a distant cousin of the Earl named Charles Beckett. Reluctantly, Araminta agreed. Violet, furthermore, took Posey to live with her, as she could not stand the way her mother treated her. But moreover, Sophie slapped her stepmother in Posey's defense. Later that day, Benedict reaffirmed his desire to marry her, regardless of the deal her mother had made or the truth about her origins. He apologized to her for asking her to be his mistress. She told him that she had understood the situation and did not judge him. After that, they had a romantic night together, where we learn that they would be married in 3 days. The epilogue takes us 7 years in the future, when Benedict and Sophie are already parents of 3 children, and she has just given him the news that she is pregnant for the 4th time, and they both hope it will finally be a girl.